Hi, my name's Rachel. Hola is the extent of my Spanish. It has not improved since I've been here, although I have learned how to order a white wine, which has been very useful. My name is Rachel Martin. I am the Global Director of Sustainability at Elsevier, and I thought at this point it would be really great to perhaps give you a publisher's perspective of how we have our sustainability journey, what we learnt along the way, and how that kind of intersects with this idea of labeling, addressing carbon emissions, and driving down emissions. Sustainability is something that Elsevier has been working on for quite some time. I think we started thinking about the environmental impact around 2010, mainly around paper, and that made a lot of sense. In the lead up to COP26, which was held in Glasgow, world leaders came, we all knew about carbon. We decided we were going to commit to becoming net zero by 2040, so 10 years ahead of that Paris Agreement. And since then, we've been driving very, very due diligently the idea of climate action, prioritizing climate, and what does that mean for our organization. So I think the first lesson is that we had to set our North Star. I don't know if anybody has tried to have a conversation about sustainability, but the first thing that always comes up is, what are you talking about? Because sustainability can be ESG, it can be SDG, it can be the environment, but it can also be inclusion and diversity, it can be accessibility, which is across the way over there as well. It can be a lot of different things. And I think for us, we really had a conversation, and it was a top-down conversation, so learning from Orange's principles, a conversation with our board where we said, okay, sustainability is about preserving the needs of today and preserving that for future generations. And it's the idea of delivering an inclusive, equitable, and sustainable future for both people and planet. And the best roadmap that we could find was the Sustainable Development Goals. So everyone aware of the Sustainable Development Goals? Yeah. The rainbow of love, yes. Nobody ever says that they don't want to address no poverty. But when we're thinking about climate, I encourage everybody to also think about the people aspect as well. Lots of the environmental standards, a lot of ISO standards, a lot of things like Blue Angel in Germany, have this idea of an environmental and a social element. And many times within our organizations, particularly big ones like Elsevier, we have things that are already dealing with inclusion and diversity, so it makes sense that we then extend it over to the environment as well. We also, in 2020, I was lucky enough to be part of the team that launched the SDG Publishers Compact. And I think that's been the excellent practical starting point in terms of environment for most publishers worldwide. It was designed to be everyone from a small publisher to a gigantic publisher like the Springer Natures or the Elseviers. And the idea was 10 concrete steps, really, really basic to get started. So first and foremost, it was make someone in charge of your sustainability program. And that's incredibly useful because now we've seen the rise of people with job titles like mine, Director of Sustainability, or Director of Climate Action is another one that I have seen. And the best thing there is that these people are not located in the communications department because it's not about communications, it's not about corporate responsibility. These people are in procurement, they're in operations, they're in strategy, or they're in departments where they could bring people across the company together to have these conversations. And that's been incredibly useful. The second one of the compact is you can't boil an ocean, pick an SDG or pick a few SDGs and really buckle down. And what we've done is we had our first progress report of the Publishers Compact last year. And interestingly enough, yes, address climate, but also recognize that our impact isn't just about the physical product or the digital product. It's also about the impact we have as an industry. So PricewaterhouseCoopers does a very great assessment of how businesses are dealing with SDGs. And in general, across different sectors, so this is every different type of sector out there, not just publishing, most people will prioritize SDG number 8, which is decent work and economic growth, and SDG 9, which is about industry, innovation, and infrastructure. And what's interesting is that when we survey publishing or publishing organizations, what we want to focus on is quality health. We want to talk about education. We want to talk about partnerships. We want to talk about those real pillars of society. And so it's really interesting, I think, to think about impact beyond just that idea of the physical or the digital output of what we do. The second one is when we're really focused on in climate, there's a couple of different things, and I like to think about it in terms of where do you have the most impact. If you think about emissions, emissions are generally divided up into categories called scopes. Very confusing, I don't know why they've done it. But essentially, Scope 1 is your direct emissions, your building. Scope 2 is purchased energy and heat. And Scope 3 is called value chain. And some of it is quite within your control as well. And essentially what's happened is most publishers, and myself included, will start setting science-based targets. These account for just what you can control. So your Scope 1, your Scope 2, things that you can definitely think about. Your lighting, making sure that you're not turning your lights on in your car park, those sorts of things. And I like to think about it in terms of accounting for the business carbon performance. This is really where the regulations are coming through from the EU. It's also really where people are sort of coming together and saying, okay, I've got a science-based target, but it's only a very small percentage. The biggest impact that we have is in that value chain. And so every publisher, every organization is now grappling with how do you measure it. I don't think anybody, the Microsofts and the Amazons included, have come up with a great accounting thing for the whole scopes. So what I encourage my team to do is to think about the life cycle assessment, and you heard Jordi talk about this as well, and supplier engagement, because you need to start thinking about it from a more holistic point of view. Science-based targets and the regulations will come through. I doubt that there will be an organization that will tell you that their carbon footprint has increased. I can almost guarantee those wonderful glossy carbon reporting is not going to go up. So it's only going to be based on things that they can measure, which is really reliable data. And I think where the alliance happens and where the idea of partnerships is in that life cycle where we can come together, because there's really only two ways that you can reduce your emissions and how we're going to meet net zero goals. You have to reduce your overall emissions. You have to go through your workflow processes already in place and reduce down and redesign. So we have to rethink about how it is right from the very start. And at Elsevier, we've made real progress. So again, on our corporate emissions, things that we can measure and we can change, because that's the only way that you can do it, we've had a 70% reduction since 2017. And 2023 is the first time we produced our own audited results, separate from our parent company. And you can see, and I have to laugh because we included business travel here, so flights, so you can imagine how popular I am at work. And COVID has helped a great deal, because now we're starting to think about more remote working, we're thinking about different ways. And again, all of this has an impact on how you're going to attract talent in the future, how you're going to, motivate employees. And things like these are really going to come quite standard. Lesson 3 is, again, what you can measure, you can change. So in 2021, we calculated our carbon footprint. The carbon footprint is a little bit what you can do for your personal life, but the emission categories within our organization. And essentially, which is really interesting, the biggest one is physical books and journals. 75% of our revenue comes from digital, yet the biggest carbon footprint for us was print. Obviously, we're Elsevier, we're an academic publisher, we publish science and research and textbooks. So the first thing we did is to think about what we could do. And some of it's low-hanging fruit. And if you talk to a HarperCollins or you talk to a Penguin Random House, they did the same. Where can we eliminate the waste? We published these articles, we would send them to editors, and during COVID, everyone was like, why are you sending me a printed copy? That doesn't make any sense. I could read this online. So suddenly we got to change some of those things. And so that program within our operations and publishing teams are designed to try and pull that down. The second one is editorial content creation. And I put it in there because sometimes it gets missed when we're thinking about our impact. And this basically relates to all your editors' time, your authors' time, reviewers if you're in academic publishing. And how do we actually account for this? At the moment, there is no methodology around it, so we're looking at gathering data. And it's really hard because most of the emissions are based on revenue, so we can kind of make some extrapolations, we can kind of come up with a number. This is a time area, and it's also one of the emission categories that we probably don't want to influence. I certainly don't want scientists who are evaluating scientific publications to speed on through. I'd really like the science to be based on something that is, accurate and true. And I think authors, and if you think about your editors, you want them to spend enough time to make a really quality product at the end. And so here you can think that the only emissions that you're going to get down is really making sure that your systems, your interfaces with your authors, your editors, and your reviewers are as efficient as possible. And that they don't have to spend loads of time trying to log in from different systems, which is ours in the case. 20% was business travel. Again, I'm super popular in terms of our responsible travel targets. We were reducing travel by 50%, helped by COVID. And we're also incentivizing electric travel. So we have a lot of programs which will help our employees buy electric cars. We don't have an electric fee. We don't have salary benefits if you get a car. It's electric. But more importantly, we had to install electric poles at our offices. And in Amsterdam, there's ones for bikes as well, which is fantastic. And the other one's around cloud applications. I get a lot of conversations, is print bad, is digital good? For us, this is around about 10%, and in most academic publishers, it's the same. Most of the times, we've moved our data applications, our data services over to the cloud, so they're very, very, very small for us. And of course, we're looking at making sure that's as efficient as possible. And the long tail are things like pensions, it's things like your office locations, things like making sure that you're closing floors and turning down heating if nobody's coming into the office. So where does that lead in terms of the carbon label? So I think the first thing that we had to do as an organization is to forget perfect. Carbon methodologies, and I get into trouble sometimes, and I don't know how the translation's going to do this, but I think about it like childbirth. I always thought childbirth was like completely scientifically mapped out. And then I had my child and I realized it was all very mythical and it was all very not standard. And carbon's a little bit like that as well, in that we don't really know what emission factors, what assumptions. There's big gaps in our data, and we have to just work with what we've got right now. And so when we decided, as part of the Publishing 2030 Accelerator, and we'll go into that later, we decided to create the first carbon kind of label, at least for Elsevier. And if you scan those codes, you essentially are given an online sort of website where you can see the emissions. Now, what's interesting is that when I did this, authors love this. They're like, yes, I feel so proud. People I showed it to were like, oh, this is really cool. The people who hated it was publishing, because they were like, oh, I'm not sure. But this is beyond just a label. I've heard a lot of talk about just labeling at the moment. What this is really about is a decision-making tool, particularly in books. At the moment, and I can guarantee it's not just in academic, but in trade and education, there's a lot of editors who are like, I like that smell of paper. I think that we need to do that. None of which is based on any science or any environmental considerations. What this does is brings a really practical tool around the table together with marketing, sales, and the publisher to have a consideration of environment when we're looking at commissioning content. And what this could potentially do, and that's what we're trying to do within Elsevier, is to make sure that you start figuring out what that data bandwidth is. Now, these books were paperback. They generally range between 1 and 4 kilos. The number doesn't matter, but what matters is I now know if I was to do this and there was a new book in Elsevier and I produced a number that was 10 kilos, I'm way out. I need to go back and I need to think through, okay, what was that paper type? What was that supplier? Could I change that? And I think the issue with books is that these decisions are being made which will influence my carbon reporting in 2 to 3 years. So I want to make sure that there's something that's quick and fast and dirty in order for them to start thinking about some of those elements and at least having that sustainability conversation. And that's before we even get into the idea of having it like a supermarket label. And the last lesson, because I like to be on time, is to be net positive. A lot of times you begin thinking about carbon, reduce carbon, and that's super cool. But carbon is not the enemy. There's good carbon, trees are carbon, mountains are carbon, and that's also really great. What we want to do is eliminate the bad carbon and think about how we can make sure carbon's good for our use. And so some of the things that we're going to do are worth a tree. You know, the Lancet, for example, we produce this. They do the Planetary Health Countdown every year. That's worth a tree if it changes the minds and our societies. And I think we have to think that we are not pens, we are not fast fashion, and thank goodness we're not cement and industry steel. The technology solutions are here, and I think what we can do is really think about the books that you love should love the planet as well. They should be, as Geordie said, you know, produced as environmentally friendly as possible. But some of them, I don't know about you, but I still have my university books. My mum actually saved one of my textbooks from when I was at primary school. These are all carbon saved. They're like little carbon bricks in your bookshelf. And that's also okay. And we need to be reconciling that, yeah, that's a great thing as well. And we need to be proactive about that. And the other thing is harness your employees. The people who feel most passionate about this are people within the organization. The number of times I get a call and say, oh my God, Rachel, I just learned that I shouldn't have meat. What's the dietary thing on? I get lots of those. I also get lots of people confessing their carbon sins to me as well, which is a little awkward. But employees are really a great driver. There's only one person at our company that has sustainability in the title, and that's me. But I don't drive sustainability. I need each and every person within my organization to have a sustainability mindset. Because I need the person in the events department who decides not to print the leaflets. I need the person in HR who decides that maybe they'll put a little, clause in the HR contract which says, hey, you don't have to come into the office during peak times. Why don't you come in and be a little bit more flexible? So you have the idea that everyone in your organization has to be kind of facing that idea. And that's why things like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Publishing Compact, or setting a net zero goal is really, really important. And the other example I'm just showing here is the Sustainable Development Goal Book Club. We launched it with the International Publishers Association and the United Nations team. We have 17 lists for children's books aged 6 to 12 in all 6 UN official languages, including Spanish. And we're now looking at local language clubs. So we're about to launch one in the Netherlands, but there's one in German, there's one in Indonesia, there's one in Norway. And these are really great examples of how we can make an impact as well. So hopefully that gives you a bit more of a rounded idea of how publishers are kind of dealing with it. But if you've got any questions, I'd be happy to take some questions. Thank you.